My name is David Stevens. I'm an attorney at Whiteford, Taylor and Preston in our Baltimore office. I'm going to be talking with you today about the new federal overtime regulations that will be taking effect on January 1st, which will change the standard for determining whether employees qualify as exempt from the overtime requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So as of today, we're about 2 weeks from the effective date of the new regulations. So we wanted to provide an overview of what's going to be changing so that anyone who may not have been following this development will be aware of what's going to be required once the new rules take effect. So before we get started, I want to point out that the information I'm going to be providing today is a general overview of the new regulations and is not intended to provide legal advice. I would note specifically here that the question of whether a particular employee does or does not qualify as exempt will generally depend on factors specific to that employee and his or her job duties. So you should consult with legal counsel concerning any questions or concerns as to whether someone qualifies as exempt. So as a starting point to understand what's changing, we should briefly discuss how the overtime requirement operates. The starting point at the federal level is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the statute that provides that employees must be paid time and a half for any hours above 40 during a given work week. The Fair Labor Standards Act then exempts certain types of jobs from that requirement. The most common exemptions are the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions. So that naturally raises the question of how do you know whether a position qualifies for one of these exemptions? And the answer is that the Department of Labor has issued regulations that set out the requirements that must be met in order for those exemptions to be satisfied. For the most common exemptions, such as the executive, administrative, and professional, the regulations impose two different requirements for each exemption that must be satisfied in order for a position to qualify as exempt. The first of those requirements is what's known as the duties test, which means that the primary duty of the employee must line up with the requirements that have been established for that particular exemption. For example, the duties test for the executive exemption requires that the employee have as their primary duty the management of the business or some department within the business, and also that the employee customarily direct the work of two full-time employees and have the ability to hire or fire employees or effectively recommend personnel decisions that affect others. The second of the two requirements for each of the exemptions is that the employee be paid on a salary basis at a rate that's equal to or above the threshold amounts that are specified in the regulations. And that's really what's going to be changing with these new regulations. So the regulations governing the overtime exemptions have been updated a number of times since the Fair Labor Standards Act was first passed, but the most recent changes were back in 2004, which is when the current salary thresholds were set. You may remember that the new regulations were originally introduced back in 2016 and then became the subject of protracted litigation and ultimately were pulled back, which led to the new rulemaking process that culminated in the regulations that we're talking about today. So here's the key change under the new regulation. The salary threshold to qualify for the exemptions is being raised from $455 per week to $684 per week. So on an annualized basis, that's the difference between a salary of $23,660 per year and $35,568 per year, a difference of about $12,000. And as you can see on the slide, the 2016 regulation that never took effect would have increased the threshold much further, up to more than $47,000. So what does this change mean? Well, if an employee is currently classified as exempt and is being paid at a salary lower than the new threshold, the exempt status will be lost as of January 1st unless his or her salary is increased to the new threshold. The decision to whether to increase an employee's salary in order to maintain the exemption will likely depend on particular circumstances relating to the individual's employment. For instance, if an employee is working a significant number of hours and is currently being paid a salary that's just under the new threshold, the employer would likely choose to increase the salary prior to January 1st in order to maintain the exemption. On the other hand, if an employee only occasionally exceeds 40 hours in a work week and is being paid near the current threshold, where it would take a change of about $10,000 or $11,000 in pay to reach the new threshold, the employer may decide that it's not to their benefit to maintain the exempt status and might instead choose to convert the position to non-exempt. The approach that any employer takes is going to depend on factors specific to their workforce, but the main point to keep in mind here is that the time frame to make that decision is closing quickly, since the new thresholds are going to be taking effect on January 1st. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that the new regulations do not modify the requirements of the duties test. So even if an employee is being paid on a salary basis at an amount above the new threshold, they still must qualify under the duties requirements if they're going to properly be classified as exempt. So in other words, salary in and of itself is not sufficient to establish an exemption. Now, another component of the new regulation is that it will change the salary threshold for the highly compensated employee test. And as background here, the overtime rules contain an alternative test under which an employee can qualify as exempt. The basic idea is that if employees are being paid above a certain salary level, there's less concern that they're being exploited by circumventing the overtime rules. So the regulations provide a less restrictive version of the duties test under which those highly compensated employees can qualify for exempt status. And as you can see from the slide, the new regulation is going to increase that amount to qualify under that alternative test from $100,000 annual salary up to $107,432. Now, the final aspect of the new regulation that I'll be touching on today is a provision that requires, or a provision that provides some additional flexibility in terms of how exempt employees are paid by allowing employers to pay up to 10% of the required threshold amount in the form of non-discretionary bonuses, incentives, or commissions. So if we're thinking in terms of annual dollars, up to 10% of the required $35,568 can be paid in the form of non-discretionary bonuses or commissions under the new rules. And the new rules also provide a mechanism under which if the employee gets to the end of the year and would otherwise lose exempt status because, for example, a commission wasn't earned and the employee therefore wasn't paid the full threshold amount, the employer can make an end-of-year catch-up payment to meet the threshold amount and maintain the exemption. That's not likely to be something that all employers will have an interest in using, but it does provide an additional option in terms of satisfying the threshold that was not present under the prior regulations. So that brings us to the end of our discussion of the new regulations. I hope that you found the conversation to be informative, and certainly the key takeaway here is the timing of the changes, which again are set to go into effect on January 1st, 2020. To the extent that employers have concerns about how to comply with these new regulations or how to determine whether an employee qualifies for exempt status, I would certainly encourage them to seek out legal counsel on those issues. So thank you for joining me today.